have to move on. Sorry. You ready, Eva? One way of answering the question, what is Europe, is to say, well, what is not Europe? And that leads into our question, our session now about Russia. And we're fortunate to have three people who, in the remainder of this introductory session, are going to deal with the question about Russia and Europe. Let me first introduce Eva Polonska, who will in turn introduce the rest of her team and let us know how this question is being addressed. Welcome, Eva, and over to you. I should say, folks, you've got the notes on the bios in all of your packages, so I've made it called. I'm not going to take up the time going through those bios. You can read them yourselves. So we have Eva leading this session for us, and her colleagues, Teresa and Kyle also. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming and choosing us for the nice and we really appreciate your time not to disappoint. You already answered the question, what is it that we think about Russia? Is it Europe or is it not? Can we do a bit of voting and decide up front? Maybe we can have one. Is Russia Europe? What do you think? Yes. Russia is Europe. Who's in favor? Who thinks Russia is Europe? 1, 2, 3, 4. Not even half. Who thinks Russia is not Europe? 1, 2, 3, 4 people. 6. Who doesn't have an opinion? Who doesn't know?
I have an opinion, but it's so vast. You can't. Part of it is, and part of it isn't.
Those of you who said Russia is European, what does it mean to you? Why would you classify Russia? Yes?
Because it's west of the Ural Mountains.
It's
So geographically speaking, I would consider Russia both European and Asian.
because it is in Europe. On
Geographically
European
speaking,
continent. Any other arguments? Yeah.
I would also say that the majority of Russia's cultural, political, economic framework is based in the Western.
So the decision making
So
is
the
based
decision
in
making, Moscow, St. Petersburg, etc. They're all on that.
a different
Western
argument. No, that's my argument. Okay.
I just feel Russia is an entity unto itself. It doesn't fit within Europe or within Asia. It's a separate
That's a good one.
dynamic.
And those of you who said no, Russia is not
No, that's
European. Why?
Perhaps too, with looking far into the future with resources, a lot of them are associated in the east geographically. So, and that's where the growth and development is looking as though it might be heading.
So we tend to pay attention to geography more than yes.
There was a gentleman who was influential in the formation of Europe in the 1920s and onwards, and I met him in the 60s, and he said Europe disunited will ultimately be dominated by Russia.
That's why they united.
He said that in
Not to be dominated.
1926. He said that in 1926.
Right. What is it that we have in mind when we talk about Europe? How would we analyze whether Russia is European? Yes?
I get a little more sociological with it in terms of collective identities and whatnot. And I don't think Russia identifies with what we're going to call the rest of Europe, you know, getting involved in that whole idea. Let's go for simplicity, money. I don't think they want any part of that. I don't think even if the dollar was high, they wanted any part of that. I think they wanted the big remain quite distinct, and that seems quite clear. I think the language barrier is quite diverse in terms
We're
of.
not playing things on the language barrier. There's 21 official languages. People survive
But
somehow, despite.
the way they interact, they're a little more cosmopolitan, I guess I would argue.
Who?
The rest of the EU in respect to Russia. I think Russia go around the world, their businessmen go around the world and relate with everyone, but it's on their terms rather than on the world terms, so to speak.
And one more.
On language, most of the European, almost all of them are Indo-Germanic, where Russian certainly isn't Indo-Germanic.
Yeah, hang on, it's an Indo-European language. Its grammar is very similar to Latin and Greek. I assure you, I've taught it for 30 years.
We understand Russians without a problem. Like we're closer to Ukrainians or Russians than I think to the Germans. In terms of the language. Yep.
Just apart from languages and stuff like that, the one thing that I like about Russia is that that's probably one of the main reasons why the Middle East isn't glowing at the moment. So
Why?
the Middle East isn't glowing. Like if you look at the strategies, the battle strategies, and what's been going on since, like even since the GFC, but especially the last 2 or 3 years.
Well,
I
Russians
think.
will get the Nobel Peace Prize for peace, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I think as far as the chessboard goes, I think we need Russia there. Otherwise,
So this is the values that I wanted to talk about. When when I wanted to discuss Russia. I come from Poland, and to me it was a huge surprise when in Australia students were telling me, oh, Russia is an Asian country. How come? When you are in Poland, you look into Germany, and you also know that there is Russia on the other side. Russia is in Europe. But how come in Europe? Geography is not enough, so let's look at something else. Few details about the country. The largest political entity in the world, spreads across 11 time zones, much bigger than the United States or China, population 140 million. Most of them really live in Europe. Decision making is based in Europe. But I would say this is not what makes Russia European. It's something else where I would be looking at, and how I would like to, how I'm proposing to do it. I will look into history, how modern Europe has developed. I will do it with the speed of light because it's about 300 years to cover. You know most of it, but I'll just mention a few things in brief. I will discuss what Russia had in common with Europe in the past, what does it have in common with Europe now, and I will be looking into politics, into economy, in terms of the way people think about politics, think about economy, in order to assess whether Russia is European or not. After that, Teresa will talk about Russia under Putin's only. She'll have lots of nice videos and clips, so just to wake you up in case you're bored. So let's go back to Europe and to ideas that started, that gave the foundations for Europe that started emerging back then. What kind of ideas emerged? What kind of ideas people had in mind? Something about the laws, equality, that laws should be made for everyone, not just for one person sitting on the throne, for example. Something about freedom of speech. I may not agree with your ideas, but I will defend your right to say it with my life, said another. Or something about universalism. I'm a man first with all the rights and equality with other people, and then I'm a French, and this is only because I was born in France. If I was born in China, I would still enjoy the same rights, believed another. So those ideas were born in Europe, in England, in France, spread across the Atlantic, contributed to the foundation of the United States we know today, to their constitution, to their Bill of Rights, came back to Europe, and then spread across Europe. What is it? People believed about in equality between people, about the rights we have, not about the rights granted to us by the king. They believed that those rights were universal, everyone deserved them, so some people had to be freed from the oppressors. And also, there was a huge belief in reason, not in the truth told to people by the Bible and the priests, but by some truths that we can discover using our own senses. All in all, Europe that had started entering the modern era back then, what did it produce? Modern sciences, modern thinking, rational thinking. People started inventing telescopes, looking into the universe, into the skies, into the heaven, and they didn't see God back then in the sky, right? So they thought, is this really truth, what they are telling me at school, what they are teaching my kids? God does not exist. Why am I being constantly told that the world is organized the way it is? Because God had this plan for us. Those people who invented telescopes, other people invented machines, steam engines, all sorts of inventions that later were very much useful in something that became factories, producing stuff. There was a brave young man from Scotland who wrote a book in which he said, if we want to look for wealth, we don't find it buried in the ground. It's not the precious metals, it's the work. It's what we can do with our work if we organize it nicely, if we add a little bit of self-interest into it, if we have profit in mind, if we organize the production in this way, then we will prosper. This is how nations can build their wealth. It was Adam Smith, of course. The idea was quickly spread across Europe as well. This also led to political change. What kind of change? Once we have a vibrant middle class, people saying, I can do it, whether you want me or not, what happens with that person, with everything he or she has, and his or her relations with the king and his orders? Do we want to listen? Do we want to depend? Do we want to be subjects? Would you? So, if you listen to the British people, they will tell you it's from the economic liberalism where we have political change coming. If you listen to the French people, they will tell you, no, it's ideas first. We don't have to be rich before we actually reach for our rights and freedoms. So So this is what's happening in Europe, and this is where Europe is going, towards something that we will later call liberal democracy. It's not a smooth ride, there will be lots of bumps on the way, but this is what starts back then. Is this what's happening in Russia? Does politically, economically, is Russia thinking this in the same way? Why not?
Oh, I would think that the way Putin has manipulated the political structure
But
definitely.
that's history, that's 200-300 years ago. We still,
They hadn't had the industrial revolution yet.
Britain had their own revolution,
Their industrial
revolution, it
they
didn't
were
work.
behind.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Tsars and Tsarines had invited generations of Germans and had brought in philosophy and ideas from elsewhere in Europe. So historically there's been much transmission of German and British science and philosophy and literature into Russia.
That's true, but the only difference is that Germans for a long time also had the so-called enlightened despots, right? They were people not eager to leave their palaces and thrones, but eager to introduce some reforms. So what happens in Russia? Russia, for a long period, is an empire, which is in a way something that's happening in the West. Because in the West we have empires, people invading everyone else. It's quite huge. It's second after the British Empire power in Europe, and it's one of the last absolute monarchies in Europe. One of the major great powers, a power to reckon with. Everyone is scared of Russia at that point. Every now and then the map comes from, I think, 1815, but if it came from a year later, it would be a different one. Russia aligns itself with many people. Russia matters in Europe. Everyone wants to be on the side of Russia, especially when the little guy jumps on the horse and spreads freedom from France to everyone else across Europe. So they don't want it. They want to stay in their palaces. They want to be kings and emperors. So they don't want Napoleon time to tell them people should be free. So Russia matters back then. And Russia has a huge, gigantic flow, cultural flow with Europe. In terms of agriculture, literature, music, this is where Russia contributes, learns a lot, and exchanges a lot with the rest of Europe. If you do any course in literature and don't have those four guys mentioned, I bet it's a very bad course in literature. Russia, culturally, it's definitely a giant. Politically or economically, not so much, because what Europe is engineering in the West has very liberal implications. All these ideas of autonomy as individual and human rights, in the future Nobel Peace Prize for spreading the idea. This is not something that the Eastern model of enlightenment has in mind, because Eastern model of enlightenment is engineered by absolutist monarchs. They want to stay in power, and they have different ideas how to enlighten their people. So what are they scared of? They are scared of the fact that if they educate their masses, if they let people think, then the masses will definitely get rid of them at some point. So they want to keep them quiet, uneducated, and every now and then they introduce some reforms. This is not only in Russia, this is in Spain, this is in Austria, this is in Germany. Some reforms are really introduced to keep people happy, but there is a limit. There is no talk about freedoms, there is no talk about human rights or anything like this. In Russia, it becomes a very official policy objective to do what the West of Europe is doing. But this is very symbolic, because it only translates into what you wear and whether you have a beard or not, because you become modern when you dress in a modern way. This is the policy under the Peter the Great. The capital is moved to St. Petersburg just to be closer to the West, and so they can come and exchange ideas, but those ideas don't reach far out of the palace. Common people do not discuss them the same way as they discuss in coffee houses in England or in suburbs in France. What else do? They speak French, because this is what people think is modern. Fashion, especially from France, becomes very popular. And also people read Voltaire but do not think in terms the way you think. They become skeptics. But criticism is not really allowed much, right? There is universities opening at the same time. Mikhail Lomonosov, one of the founders of the university in Warsaw, but not as many. If we compare Russia to a tiny little Scotland, where Scotland produced 3 gigantic universities, but even today the royal family sends their children to study, we will see this is not happening on such a scale as in the west of Europe. It's working. Another great Tsar, who personally knows all the thinkers from France, doesn't share the ideas, doesn't allow for the ideas to be discussed elsewhere, and although she did say that she wanted the greatest good for her people, she in fact increased serfdom and actually crushed rebellions that people organized in her country, and there is no legacy of political and economic reform under her reign. There was opposition to this, of course. Opposition ended up in Siberia, something that starts from that moment onwards, and maybe Siberia will be a very popular destination for 200 years to come. Russia is also doing what Western powers are doing. So in this regard, with the dark side of Europe, Russia has a lot in common. Everyone is invading, well, everyone who matters, invading somebody else. So does Russia, with the only difference that when the Western powers decide that they would chop Africa into pieces, Russia is not part of this because Russia's heart is set on Asia. Russia expands into the Asian continent, acquires lots of mass land, starting from the light green, going to the east of Europe, Finland, to the south, in northern China. So this is where Russia is focusing. Is there a difference if you have an empire? Does it matter for your economy in the future if your empire is in one piece, or you are tiny little Britain and have your land and resources owned? Why? How does it matter?
Well, it means that the policies in Siberia was always still to be decided in Moscow. The British, in the end, because of the Napoleonic War and other events, had to grant self-rule in Australia. A degree and earlier than anything the Russians had ever done in the eastern part of the world.
And in terms of economic development, in terms of economic development, does it
and in terms of creation of universities, in terms of home rule. Australia got home rule in the early 19th century, in fact. I mean, different colonies. In Russia, that was not possible.
Yes.
I would suggest that because the Russian Empire was unitary and contiguous, it enabled centralisation to build on the point we made before, centralisation to stay in Moscow, and for Moscow to keep firm control of the resources in Russia's east, whereas, and that contrasts with the British experience, where because there were huge sea lanes separating London from supposedly its resources, eventually that led to having to grant home rule and an empire splitting apart. Whereas because it was in a sense geographically together, albeit distant, Moscow under the Tsars and then under the Soviets were able to consolidate land that they had because they could keep it all supplied and under control.
But how would you compare the amount of work that's needed to, for example, develop this mass of land that is in one piece and develop yourself as Britain without actually thinking of India or Nigeria or Ghana, that is also part of your empire but not part of your landmass? Which one would you be developing? Where would you be investing your resources if you were the British king or the Russian? Where would you be? What would you be developing? What's easier to do?
Well, the English aristocracy did not allow the development of England to a great extent. In fact, they fought, for example, education in England, because if you educated Englishmen, it would only cause the French Revolution to come to England. As a consequence, the English elite invested in Canada and Australia rather than in England. Supermarkets came to Australia before they came to England as a consequence.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you, because my idea was that once you have your empire spread all over the world, you don't invest in those faraway bits.
No,
you invest in yourself.
you invested because investments in Victoria did not endanger the social standing of the landed gentry in England. But investing in England meant that every guy could, for example, have a car. They went so far as to impose legislation in England that if you drove a car, you had to have one man on a horse and a flat truck. riding in front of the car. That killed the beginning of the English automobile industry. That's why the French and the Germans got ahead of him, because of that legislation. And the English lords would say, well, if I ride on a horse, everybody knows that I am the boss. Now, if somebody else, if the status symbol becomes a car, then I'm no longer guaranteed my position. My social position is endangered. As a consequence, you have the Red Flag Act.
I'm glad you mentioned transportation available in the 19th century, for example, because for Russia it was a gigantic problem, right? Once we were trying to develop, to build and invest in infrastructure, by the time you moved from Moscow and arrived on that horse somewhere in Kamchatka, a month went by and different things were in place when you were leaving. So that's
just going back to the argument about whether you span out as an empire like the British did or whether you concentrate on yourself. I think we need to remember that countries like Portugal, well not now, but Spain, the Netherlands, and I'm just picking a few off, Belgium, the British Empire, their wealth is because they colonised. They went to the empire and they brought that wealth back, whether it was through slavery, whether it was through spices, whatever it was exploitation of the country.
Exploitation for the benefit of a small
that allowed it. And
right?
I would argue that,
right?
and I would argue that a lot of the ideas that came from those countries, particularly from the UK, would not have happened had that wealth not allowed it to happen. So they could then afterwards say, we don't need the colonies anymore. We've got our wealth, and then continue, and that's what they did. And the creation of the EU had a massive impact on a lot of those countries as well, because there were a lot of trade agreements that existed that were then dropped as a result. And a lot of those, who were producing, like sugar, raw sugar, that went to the centre to be processed and came back as processed sugar, which, there were a lot of things. So I think it's important to remember that a lot of these countries, their wealth and their wealth was because of colonisation, and the ideas that flourished may not necessarily have done so had they not colonised.
Russia doesn't have problems with wealth because whatever you have in the soil, Russia has it. Whether it's gold, diamonds, or energy resources, Russia has it. The problem was with the gigantic size of it, right? So once industrialization was on the agenda, because it was, the size was always a problem, right? Supervising investment, getting the orders done was a problem, right? So this is where Russia did not succeed, probably because of the size, probably because of huge corruption, and what else? Huge landmass, right?
Maybe it's also easier to move things around by boat, over the sea, over the water, and perhaps across land it's just more difficult.
It's cheaper, you don't need that infrastructure, just one boat to carry as much as you want. And here, once you have a carriage, you need a road, you need some horses, you need to feed them, right? You need
Or a
to
train line.
buy somewhere, some hotels or somewhere, I don't know, something. We had lots of jokes about Trans-Siberian railroads, but once we started building it, they never came together. So, but these are our nasty jokes about Russians. Russian Empire comes to an end at the beginning of the 20th century. There is war with Japan. There is opposition from within growing quite strongly. We know that revolution is on the way. That revolution also has certain ideas, and those ideas result in a new regime. Is it similar to that of what's happening in Europe? What is it based on? The new ideas of a new regime. Not royal Russia anymore. What are they after? What is it that they are proposing? How are they going to produce wealth and prosperity and growth? How? Marxism. What was Marxism about?
Well, the revolution meant that they were trying to compete with Europe, but the reality was that because they were
But in what way? In a similar way? In the way that
they were trying to do something that was a European idea, but didn't fit into Russia because Russia wasn't industrialized, and as you just said, unlike Britain, was so large that it's quite difficult to manage all people unless you have an empire that one person is running Russia, which people would argue people to today.
The ideas employed by the new regime was collectivization. Okay, making things together, collectively. Being in charge of things, running businesses together as a collective. Because what Marx did was he traveled extensively throughout Britain and Germany. He saw a lot of inequality being produced by those who have and those who didn't have. And he said, well, capitalism is not something that produces wealth. Oh, but it did produce wealth, but it also produced produced a lot of dislocations and disappointment, right? So he proposed something else, and the Russians decided why not. Did it work for them? It didn't, because very early in the first years of the regime, they produced famine. Lots of people dead, starving, right? Or those who were not happy with the system simply killed, or again sent to Siberia. So in this way, I wrote Russia moves away from Europe, but it's never been looking into Europe. It's never shook hands with Europe. So it's a wrong word, because Russia has a different idea. It's not the one that's developing in the west of Europe. Stalin dies, but the system goes on. Dictatorship, lack of freedoms. This is after the war, when Europe is already integrating all countries in the Western Europe and declared democracies, human rights are on the agenda, except for the south of Europe, where we still have dictatorships. So this is what's happening in Russia, and its influence is not only in the Soviet Union, but also outside. All over Central Europe, countries have to listen. Their own leaders have to go on the first trip to Moscow. I think one or two of them never came back. So they were going for instructions. The map is wrong. The map has Yugoslavia split quite early, so apologies for this. In the 80s, we have another new idea coming from Mikhail Gorbachev. What does he want? He wants the common European home. He now sees into the West, into the freedoms that people are enjoying, into the wealth that is being produced over there, and he finally admits that perhaps democracy, perhaps free markets is the way to go. They have produced better standard of living, better quality cars, less unemployment. So let's go for it. He introduces his reforms, and the two gentlemen dismantle the Berlin Wall, and the system collapses. It was called the end of history by one of the scholars. Why did he say it was the end of history? Not that the history ended. What was the idea? The end of history happened because liberal democracy won. He really believed that humanity has never developed anything else better than that. So that's why it's the end. All other alternatives like communism, like socialism, they all collapsed. Liberal democracy is the way to go. That's why it's the end of history. So we come into Russia of today. Not everyone is happy with Gorbachev. Radical ideas are too radical for some people. There is a coup organized against him. He is held in Crimea, for example, for a while. And there is another person, Boris Yeltsin, who actually confronts the rebellion and stops those who want to reintroduce communism again. And he's the one who becomes the president of Russia, because the Soviet Union collapses, falls apart the same year, and 14 or 15 new countries emerge from the old Soviet Union. What happens? Yeltsin commits to democracy, to free elections, free democratic institutions and democratic decision-making processes, consultation with everyone, rule of law, independent courts, and also to free market economy, because this is what he thinks that produces growth. Communist Party is banned, and this is really the first time in history when Russia shows that we will think the way you think, you people in the West. So this is the only time over the last 300 years that Russia shows politically and economically kind of alliance. How does it work for them? Not really well, because Yeltsin goes into trouble with his own parliament. Let's blame it on the people who, for example, were not born in democracy, don't know how to handle democracy. They fall into all sorts of trouble. I remember we watched lots of news during those days. People were using their fists in the parliament to carry the argument across. So this is, we had the same problems in Poland, but we thought, because on that particular day we didn't have a fight and they had, so they are worse than us. So that was our competition. Who is better at this new thing called democracy, right? So very quickly he says, it's better when I run the show and I get some more powers for myself than this parliament that cannot achieve anything. They are drowning in all the squabbles and fighting. What happens with the economy? No one knows how to run it. It's a gigantic enterprise, the whole state of Russia. huge resources, no one knows how to go about it, there's no experts, no capital. All Central European countries have the same problem. They have to borrow absolutely everything from the West. What happens? What's the result? Because there is no middle class, government people who are in the government, they have the easiest, the quickest access to everything. And it's quite common that the Minister of Transport starts making profits from whatever he's responsible for. So oligarchy emerges in Russia, and this is my camera? And this is what runs the country for years to come. So I'll quickly go to Putin, because Putin is what Teresa is going to talk about. Disappointment is the major outcome of Russia under Yeltsin. Reforms implemented, but the results are not what expected. Political life was damaged, ideas were great, but not really working for them. So he resigns and appoints Putin